currently Sudan constitutes the world's largest displacement crisis. The numbers are, anywhere between 11 and 14 million people have been displaced, many multiple times. I think about over half the population of 48 million, which is, I think about 26 million or so are, on the brink of starvation, if you will, or facing famine in a country that I should add could easily feed itself. Sudan's history has shown us is that military elites have become experts at negotiating peace without ever implementing it, right? They've been, I think,
That's a bar right there.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know the exact number. My friend Khulud Khair, I think, once said that there've been about 27 peace agreements that have been signed in Sudan's history, none of which have led to justice and accountability, none of which have led to sustainable peace. In fact, peace has become a currency for military elites, kind of legitimize their war crimes, to accumulate power, right? To absorb opposition forces, to continue suppressing them, right? And so I think we need to move away from these exclusive, high-level negotiation mechanisms because they just sort of do the same, they sort of, in many ways, prolong wars.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Ladies of Sosa podcast. My name is Sahra.
And my name is Christine.
Today, we have a very, very special episode for you guys.
Wait, first of all, Happy New Year.
Happy New Year, everyone. I know we're just I'm ready to just go straight in, but Happy New Year's. Let's kind of get back and see how everybody's doing. How's everybody doing, first and foremost? It's been a while since we've done a podcast.
I'm good. I'm chilling. I done already.
You good?
I've been still making content.
How was Austin, Amanual?
Oh, Austin was dope. Yelled at people.
Oh, goodness.
Why?
I just wanted to yell at people.
Oh, okay.
Threw people out of bars. And then also got pulled over by the police coming back from Austin. So that was fun.
As you should, because you're yelling and cursing at people.
Now, mind you.
And throwing people out of bars.
Oh my goodness.
That's a way to start the
What
new
about
year.
you, Vaida? Did you go back home for...
I did go back home. I feel like life moves at a slower pace back home. And it's Kansas City, but I loved it. It was very restful, very needed. And then I came here the week a little bit before New Year's to just get a head start on work and stuff. So it was a good balance.
Yeah, when you said you went back home, I'm like, you did not go to South
I
Sudan.
didn't go to South Sudan.
No, but KK did.
Wow.
Yeah, KK, talk to us about South Sudan.
Big money KK.
I know. I saw how he was living. I was like, wow, why'd you come back?
South Sudan is beautiful. It's overall being back in the atmosphere, being around people that kind of look like you is beautiful. So it was good. Happy New Year. Glad to be back. We'll go back again, hopefully soon. But
hopefully you'll take us.
We'll have stories for off camera.
My Sudanese hotep enjoying himself back home in Black motherland.
It's good times, good food.
Tyrick accused you of being involved in corruption. Do you want to debunk those claims or no?
We saw that house.
I plead the
like
fifth.
A building.
Oh my goodness.
I'm kidding. No corruption.
I didn't
Capitalism.
accuse him of corruption. I say that he was.
Ain't that the same thing? Capitalism, corruption?
No. They're
Not
different.
necessarily.
They're both the same.
They're both the same. I mean, you could argue that. But okay, let's get into the conversation.
Yes, we have two very special guests with us today. So I'll let Sarah go ahead and introduce
How come nobody
them.
asked me about my New Year's?
Oh, yeah.
Because we don't care.
Yeah,
Your New Year's, brother.
We don't care.
Tyrick, how was your New Year's?
It was good. I didn't
That's
do
why we
anything.
didn't ask.
I did go and added additional plants. Walmart had a sale on
nice.
plants.
Okay,
So
that's great.
7
Wait,
additional
you're
You're a
kids.
plant dad?
You a plant father also?
Yeah, I got
Hey, shut
How
up.
many kids have you killed?
about 17.
Okay.
So you,
My plant son is slightly autistic, but
not actual babies.
but plants. Oh,
Right.
But I have 27. now.
Whoa, that's a
So
lot.
I'm good.
Yeah, that's
Okay.
a lot.
Growing.
Well, good
Damn,
for you.
damn, I gotta keep up because I only got one plant kid. And that nigga barely survived.
Oh my God.
All right,
man.
let's get into the episode. So before the New Year's, first and foremost, we kind of discussed how I went to the symposium in Michigan.
Yes.
Where they kind of discussed how we could address the conflict in Sudan, and that's actually how I met Nisrin. And she's actually going to be on the show today. But today's episode is really going to be focused on the Sudanese conflict and what we can do as South Sudanese, or any, like, the viewers who are watching, the audience, what we can do and to help and figure out the conflict. Because I think the issue is a lot of people, we don't really know what's going on in Sudan right now, and I think that's part of the reason why it's probably not getting as much attention as it should. But we're definitely going to get into that. But I want for Christine to kind of go into that as well.
Yeah. So basically, we just want to break it down and kind of understand the war in Sudan and what's taking place there. There's not a lot of attention that's being brought to what's going on. So I feel like a lot of that might come from people not really understanding the background of the conflict and what exactly is taking place, and how so many people are displaced right now, and how truly terrible the situation is. So we're so honored to have our two guests to be able to help us, because even Sarah and I, like, we've done our research, but we still are interested to learn exactly what is taking place. So we have two beautiful special guests from Toronto that Sarah met while she was in Michigan.
Yes. So our first guest that I'm going to introduce is Nisrin Elamin, and she's an assistant professor of anthropology and African studies at the University of Toronto. And she is currently writing a book on Saudi and Emirati land grabs and the different forms of resistance they have inspired in the Jazeera region of Central Sudan. Nisrin is also a member of the Sudan Solidarity Collective, which has been supporting local emergency response rooms in the face of a largely absent international aid community and civilian states. The collective has been doing political education around the war in Sudan and is organizing around different issues affecting Sudanese people in Canada and beyond, including immigration policies. And then I'll let Christine go ahead and introduce Khaldah.
Yes, and our second guest is Khaldah Salih, and she is a Sudanese-Canadian organizer based in Toronto. She is a member of the Sudan Solidarity Collective and has researched Sudanese activism, NGOs, and surveillance. Khaldah is also a ceramicist and has been working as a community worker and communications professional in nonprofits in Toronto for many years. So welcome, ladies. We're really, really honored to have you guys on the podcast with us today.
Yes, we're so excited.
Thank you
so much for having us.
Absolutely, absolutely. And again, I said in the beginning of the show that I met Nisrin at the University of Michigan. The African Studies program had a symposium that was kind of highlighting the current conflict in Sudan. And I remember talking to you, Nisrin, and pretty much sharing like how the way that maybe I can contribute, because I feel like I don't have all the knowledge. But one way that I can contribute is using the Ladies of Sosa platform to kind of facilitate these conversations and share the information, and just pretty much like utilizing the platform. And I think one reason why maybe some people may not like be focused or understand what's going on in South Sudan, because they think it's too complicated. So I think the goal for today is to kind of make it where the everyday person can understand, the youth can understand, because we have a lot of young people that watch our show. Our audience is, I think, 18 to 20 to like 30,
18 to 35,
18 to 35, so pretty young. So trying to break it down to where like to a level where we can all understand and grasp it. And I think that more people will be able to like feel involved or contribute or try to like, understand the situation. So where do you guys want to start? Let's go ahead and give you guys the floor to introduce yourselves, speak more about like what you do. Khaldah, since you're already on screen, do you want to go ahead and start?
Yeah, well, first of all, thank you so much for having us and for using your platform to be able to, provide information to folks. It's true, it is complicated, and there is a lot of missing information, but at the same time, some things are actually pretty straightforward, and there's just a lack of kind of attention and information being disseminated. So we're really glad to be able to use this opportunity to talk about what's happening in the war and what the Sudan Solidarity Collective has been doing, and the solidarity that we're trying to provide to folks on the ground. So it's really great to be here. And I'm coming to you also from Toronto, Canada.
Awesome. And then Nisrin.
Yes. Hi. Thank you so much for this opportunity. I moved to Toronto about 2 years ago, but mostly grew up in Germany and in the States. So for me, and I've been involved in kind of Sudan-related activism really since the genocide in Darfur started in 2003. So I'm excited to be here and to talk more about what's happening, which I think has to be understood in relation to the history of South Sudan and the history of resistance, right? Popular resistance against the Sudanese state as well. So
awesome. Well, can you walk us through the 2018 revolution and how it connects to the current conflict? What were people fighting for then, and what's changed now?
Yes, thank you for that question. I think it's particularly important to start with the revolution because I think it's important to understand this war as a counter-revolutionary war, as a war that is being waged to prevent basically civilian rule and democracy and the goals of the revolution from being attained. But before I start actually talking about the revolution, I wanted to take us a little bit further back to the 1950s, because I think the 1950s, when the Sudanese state was first forming, is an important moment for kind of understanding what the root causes of state violence are and sort of the long history of state violence that we have to kind of situate this war in. And again, I feel like I'm taking a risk here as a non-historian, as someone who's not from South Sudan, but I do want to start in 1955 with the Taurit Mutiny that I'm sure your listeners are familiar with, because I think it's a moment, during which South Sudanese took up, resisted, right, took up arms against the central government in response to a process, right, of state formation that excluded the vast majority of the country, and certainly South Sudan, right, in the sense that, when people first resisted the Sudanese state, they were resisting a Sudanization process, right, this process that the British essentially had handed over to mostly northern and central Sudanese elites to form a kind of, independent Sudanese government. So as an example, the British vacated 800 administrative seats in 1955. Civil servants, agricultural scheme managers, top army and police officials, etc., across the country on the eve of independence, of which Sudan's new ruling elite only allocated 6 to South Sudan, right, which at the time was an area the size of Texas with a population of over 2.5 million. And the remaining 790 plus seats were primarily occupied by elites from the kind of north and center. And so this Sudanization process from the very beginning enshrined the kind of systemic marginalization of South Sudan, but also other parts of the country like Darfur, like South Kordofan and the Blue Nile region. And so, when people, in 1955, in August of 1955, when South Sudanese members of the British-administered Sudan Defense Force Equatorial Corps mutinied, right, in the town of Taurit, it was partly in response to that Sudanization process, right, that was led by northern elites. But also, and this is to me very interesting as someone who's interested in labor history, it was also in response to a labor protest that followed the abrupt dismissal of 300 South Sudanese workers from a textile factory that had been kind of taken over by northern elite, during which 14 South Sudanese protesters who were protesting nonviolently against, the dismissal of workers, were killed by the army.
Nisrin, I have a quick question. When you say
Yes.
Sudanization process, what do you mean by that?
So it was essentially the process through which the British colonial government, turned the kind of rule over to Sudanese, like northern and central Sudanese,
gotcha.
right? So that's essentially what happened, is they were leaving Sudan and had these 800 seats open that they were then filled primarily by people from the north and center, at the expense of kind of a marginalization of many
The
other
southern region, like the southern Sudanese.
Exactly. Hence why, right, 800 seats left open, only 6 went to South Sudan. And so, when people took up arms, right, during the Taurit Mutiny, I think what's important there is that they were demanding from the very beginning more political representation in government, right? Regional autonomy, equitable distribution of resources, right? Of course, South Sudan was governed separately during, Anglo-Egyptian rule and was purposefully underdeveloped, and so also more development funds, right? And so those demands are still very relevant today for many people across the country. Certainly in 2003, when the genocide in Darfur started, it was, rebel movements that emerged demanding almost the same thing as South Sudanese resistance fighters were demanding in 1955. And so again, there we saw a challenge to the very legitimacy of the Sudanese state that from its very inception was violent, was extractive, was ethno-nationalist, right? From the very beginning, from the 1950s, you had processes of forced Arabization and Islamization imposed on a multi-religious, multilingual, right, multicultural country that, of course, impacted people differently depending on where they were located in the country. So I wanted to kind of start with that to say that we often look to the Bashir regime as the sort of culprit of all of this, but it really started long before then, with the very formation of the Sudanese state. And I bring up that labor strike in particular because there was nonviolent resistance, right, by South Sudanese in the very beginning that was squashed violently, that then led to the mutiny. And I think a lot of people don't necessarily know about that. Historian Skopas Pogo taught me a lot about that. He's written a book about the Tory mutiny. So I just wanted to start there before kind of going to the revolution. And sorry to kind of dig into.
Thank you for that.
No, I think that's actually great. You guys, and I want you guys all to contribute to the conversation as well. I think that's perfect. And I think when we get further into the conversation, we'd want to kind of get into the weeds of South Sudan and Sudan as well, because I think even our viewers, because not everybody that watches our show is Sudanese or South Sudanese, so they don't really understand the difference or the history, yes. And they're like, so why did you guys separate? So I think that's a really good way to frame the conversation as well as start the conversation. Yeah.
And so with that history being said, how does that connect to the current conflict?
Yes. So, so I think the next kind of important moment here in terms of the more recent history is the revolution, right? The December 2018 revolution, where people essentially, it started outside of Khartoum, unlike the sort of 1964 and 1985 uprisings, which also overthrew military dictatorships. This one started sort of in the more peripheral regions, in Atbara and in Damazin, in Mairno and Sennar state, right? By people who had different grievances, primarily around the deepening economic crisis that was triggered by IMF recommended austerity measures that tripled the price of bread, right? Many people, I'm sure, heard about what happened in Atbara, where, high school, industrial school students discovered that their breakfast sandwich had tripled overnight, and went out into protests towards the ruling party, the NCP's ruling the headquarters, and burnt it down. And that kind of sparked the revolution. Of course, the causes, right, were much deeper than that. The protests, in many ways were a continuation of protests that had happened in 2011 that were crushed brutally. Then again, 2012, 2013, 2016. So until, it kind of erupted in a much more massive way in 2018. And so then you saw in February of 2019, the protests kind of coming from various cities. I think there were about 21 cities where protests had erupted. They kind of converged in Khartoum in front of the military headquarters, right? And the demands were multiple, but one of the main ones was for al-Bashir to step down, was for all the wars, in the ongoing wars in Sudan to end, for a new constitution, for a sort of new legal system, right? There were many, many demands that went beyond regime change. And then, of course, in April, al-Bashir was overthrown. That was kind of quickly taken over by a transitional military council of people sort of from within al-Bashir's inner circle, notably Hemiti, who's the head of the Rapid Support Forces, and al-Burhan, head of the army. We'll talk about a little bit more later. But after, al-Bashir fell and the transitional military councils took over, people remained in this massive sit-in in front of the military headquarters because, again, their demands went way beyond regime change. They wanted kind of it was, to me, a vision of a new Sudan that in some ways was parallel to the vision of the new Sudan that the late Dr. John Garang has sort of articulated and written about. And it was about, ending this sort of, really, to me at least, it was about challenging the violent, extractive, ethno-nationalist nature of the state, right? And so people remained in place. As we know, in June of 2019, the sit-in, which I think at its height had about 1 million people from all over the country, right, gathered there in front of the sort of center of power, was brutally kind of dismantled by military elites led by the RSF. Over 100 people were killed. Their tents were set, ablaze. And then after that violent massacre, there was a process of kind of negotiation between civilian elites and military elites, and then they formed a transitional government in August of 2019. But even then, with the sort of formation of that transitional government, power was always tilted in favor of military elites, which made political reforms very difficult. And the civilian side of that government was also an elite kind of group of people who didn't necessarily represent the grassroots formations, notably
the common interests like of the regular people.
Exactly, who were still on the streets, right, protesting, who were organizing boycotts and strikes and all kinds of things.
Yeah. Can you talk to us about, like, what is the difference between the Sudan Armed Forces, the SAF, and the Rapid Support Forces? Are they two sides of the same coin? Like, can you dive into that, and what role do they play into the current conflict for the people who do not know anything about Sudan?
Sure. I think maybe Khaldah, if you want to jump into that on that question, that would be great as well, and then I'll go back and forth with you.
Yeah, sounds great. And yeah, please jump in if there's any clarification needed. So the Sudan Armed Forces is the Sudanese military, the military of the government and of the state. The Rapid Support Forces, the RSF, is a paramilitary force that came out of the Janjaweed, which was, did the fighting and perpetuated genocide in Darfur in the early 2000s. The Janjaweed, by the SAF, by the military, by the state, and at this point in time, it's, essentially you could say it's all the same under the Bashir regime. They were formed into officially the Rapid Support Forces and became this paramilitary force. So they were, I think from the perspective of people on the streets in the revolution, these are sorts of two things that are doing similar stuff. The Janjaweed were this very violent paramilitary force that had done so much violence and harm in Darfur, and was, from the perspective of someone who was, for example, in Khartoum during the 2018 and 2019 revolution, had come to Khartoum and was doing sort of similar violence and working alongside the SAF, the Sudan Armed Forces, which represents, the Islamist regime, the military power that has taken over the country for decades and decades and decades, and was still not letting go of power. The RSF also was very legitimized by the European Union in 2014. So there's the Khartoum process of 2014, which was an agreement and a process created by the European Union to basically halt African immigration into Europe. And so they used the RSF as essentially border control, in the Sudan-Libya border and stuff, to stop Africans from migrating into Europe, because this is at the height of their, the European migration crisis. So in an effort to stop Africans from going to Europe, they legitimized this very violent paramilitary force, the RSF, by Europe did that, right? And then they continued to have a role. And then during the revolution and during the June 3rd massacre that Nisrin talked about, where the sit-in was ended, and in the aftermath of all of that, again, from the perspective of folks on the street in the revolution, there were these two forces that were fighting revolutionaries, that were fighting protesters, that were stopping this from happening and working together to maintain power, maintain a military state. And at that point in time in the revolution, after Bashir had fallen, the demands of the revolution were to have a civilian government, to have Medaniya, and to have a government that was free from the RSF, that is free from SAF, because that violence had taken over for so long. And I think in that moment also, while the revolution obviously started out and continued to be about the economic troubles of Sudanese people and regular Sudanese people, I think the process of the revolution itself kind of grew people's political consciousness and understanding of what was really happening and an understanding of what the military was doing and what the military's role was. It's not as easy to say that like, oh, the military is who can protect us, because then you could see finally that they were doing these harms, that they were being violent in this different way. And for a lot of people in Khartoum, it was maybe the first time they'd experienced that or they'd seen that while it was happening in other parts of the country, in Darfur and South Sudan and in the Nuba Mountains and so on. So that's sort of what the SAF and the RSF are. And then we come to now, or we come to rather April 2023, when, as much as they were power sharing, they decided that they were fighting each other, and it became so that Sudanese people and Sudan itself was like the battleground for this fight between them. They're both trying to hold power. They're trying to take power from each other. They want to be the ones in control, with Hemeti ruling the RSF, or head of the RSF, and Burhan head of the SAF. And then they fought each other, starting off in Khartoum, and the casualties of this war are just the civilians and the land itself. And so it's not necessarily a civil war. And I think that's sometimes where, like, when the media is trying to describe it, it's not necessarily a civil war where like there's one half of the country is on one side and the other half of the country is on the other side. It's more that there are these two factions, these two militaries, or however you want to call them, these violent groups or whatever, that are fighting each other. And there's all these people that are the victims of this war. And of course, some of these people take sides. You know, they're on this side or they're on that side, and that depends on the location they're in, maybe their ethnicity, whatever their safety, their security, whatever it might be. But regardless, it's not like two big populations of Sudan fighting each other with these like armed resistances as well, you know?
Yeah.
So yeah, I hope that makes sense. And
sounds a lot like what's happening in South Sudan when we occasionally get to fighting each other.
Like, yeah, when we broke out in war in 2013, how it was like two of our leaders and everybody kind of like chose sides depending on the tribe that they were from. Yeah.
Exactly.
Yes.
Now, something that you did mention was as far as the European leadership backing one party. It seems like these are two people, the RSF and SAF, they're both, there's no good guys in this conflict. It's two people, two militaries going against the people, basically. How do you feel the geopolitical nature of this whole situation going as far as people that are aligning themselves with NATO versus other Hamdini align himself with BRIC nations, with Russia and China, and then the other forces, his own president align himself with the Europeans and the NATO. Do you feel like that is pushing the conflict even further now that there are outside forces coming in as far as UAE, Russia, Europe, rather than having it regionally where it only transcribed in the nation itself? Now that it's geopolitical, because Sudan have a lot of gold that a lot of these nations do want, and a lot of resources that a lot of these nations do want.
Yeah, no, I think that's a very important question. I think it's what makes this war, to me, a sort of internationalized counter-revolutionary war, or a sort of counter-revolutionary proxy war, if you will. And like you said, I mean, I think one of the key things here about both the RSF and the army, who staged a coup together in 2021, right? Again, that was like the sort of first, maybe one of the first formal steps of the counter-revolution. And part of the reason they did that is because essentially Sudan's economy is controlled by military elites, right? About, I think, 70% of it or so. The army controls, I think, about 200 companies in cement, real estate, gum Arabic.
And that's for the majority of African countries. It's a gun culture. Yeah.
Yes, absolutely. And then you have the RSF, on the other hand, which controls most of the illicit gold trade in the country, as well as parts of the livestock trade, both of which have boomed during this war, by the way, right? So Sudan, as you mentioned, Sudan is the third largest producer of gold in Africa, and the UAE, as its main trading partner, is now kind of smuggling out gold, right? Sudanese gold, in exchange for weapons. And that's probably what is certainly sustaining the RSF. If the RSF didn't have the support of the UAE, they wouldn't be able to sustain their war effort, right? And on the other hand, you have the army, which is getting support from Egypt. And Egypt, of course, has an interest in the Nile River Basin in relation to the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam, which I think somebody was mentioning earlier, or at least like in terms of the waters, right? Like making sure that that arrangement, how much it's filled, is in their favor. And so they're getting support from Egypt. They're also getting support from Iran. And as I should have mentioned, also the RSF is getting support from the Wagner group, which I think is now called something else, but it's like Russia's. I don't know.
Is their elite forces of
yes,
basically
exactly.
the Rangers here in America.
Yes.
Yeah.
And the interesting thing, though, is that the Russians are supporting both sides, right? The Russians are also supporting the army in exchange for access to the Red Sea. Even the UAE controls a gold mine in army territory that is one of the major sources of revenue for the army. The Bank of Khartoum, which is, the main bank that supplies both, is UAE. Most of the shareholders are basically UAE owned. And so you have these external actors who are also playing both sides. You have the Ukraine also who's gotten involved on the army side, presumably because of Russia's involvement and sort of enrichment through the gold.
And a lot of that, and I had to interject here just because of with the Russian side, and a lot of that is because when the Ukraine and Russia war started, a lot of people thought the ruble was going to basically crater and collapse, and a lot that's been holding the ruble as far as in Russia's currency has been the gold coming from Sudan, and this is the reason why the Wagner group was sent out to Chad to secure those gold mines, because the gold mines is the one that's stabilizing the Russian currency and making sure that war against Ukraine keeps going. So now, so you do have a lot of outside forces that's making sure this war
going.
Yeah, keeps going.
No, absolutely. Thank you for that. And I think it's no war in 2024 has is not about profiteering, right? Like as long as people can profit from war, it continues. And so I think that's also partly why we don't hear so much about the war in the media. I think that is purposeful, right? In the sense that as long as U.S. allies can continue to enrich themselves, can continue to gain sort of political, military power through war, there will be silence, right? And there will be continued profiteering. So I think that's important. People often ask me about what's the role of, say, Canada and the United States, and it's a more indirect role. I mean, I think diplomatically they've played the role of legitimizing and propping up both Hemeti and al-Burhan, whose war crimes span decades. I mean, they really start in South Sudan and then also in Darfur. Obviously, these are war criminals that should have never been trusted in the first place, but were really propped up during the transition, during that, after the coup and right before the war in those 2 years. They were sort of propped up as potential reformists, right? Even though people on the streets, especially the resistance committees, which I think we need to talk about, these are like the more or less the sort of grassroots neighborhood like formations that were the backbone of the revolution. There's about
people
8,000.
basically.
Yeah, the people who've been very well organized, including sort of around relief efforts, who were saying there should be no negotiations, no partnership, and no legitimacy with the military. And yet the international community, the UN, right,
legitimizing them.
Yes, kept legitimizing them. And I think this is where it's important, I think, especially if you have Sudanese listeners, to make it clear that, these are two, as Khaldah mentioned, the RSF and the SAF are part of the same military state that imploded right when the war started. And they both have blood on their hands that go back to the 1950s, essentially. I mean, the RSF obviously formed later, but they're part of the same sort of state apparatus, if you will. These are state elites that have been enriching themselves from the violent displacement of people from resource-rich lands in Sudan, right? Who have been enriching themselves by, exploiting resources across the country and holding on to power by essentially starting all of these counter-insurgent wars, whether in South Sudan or in Darfur. And as we know, I mean, in the case of South Sudan, 2.5 million people were killed, right? Over the course of the two phases of the civil war. That's the same army that is now also fighting in the Jazeera, where people have historically not experienced this kind of violence, right? So in a way, the violence of this war is not unprecedented. It's just the geographic scope of it, or the kind of scale of it, is different from the previous wars, if you will.
Yeah.
But at the root, they're about the same thing, right?
And you kind of touched on it. Many people are not paying attention to this war. There's not a lot of eyes. I think during the symposium, they called it like a forgotten war or an ignored war. Like it's facing such a huge humanitarian crisis and food insecurity. Yet you don't really see it in media. And I want to kind of touch on that as well. Like, why do you think that it's not being paid attention to? You kind of
do you think it's intentional?
Yeah, I think, Nisrin, you kind of touched on it, how it is intentional, because maybe there's a lot of blood on these. There's blood on a lot of powerful people's hands and countries' hands.
A lot of other countries have a lot of interests.
I think it's more of the fact that there's no good side to choose. Majority of media and propaganda is always going to side with one person or side with one group of war. When America and Iraq, they always side with America. We're going here fighting for helping the people there. But in Sudan right now, in Khartoum, like there's no good side. And saying like the war itself is at the scope of, it is known because when I just traveled, I flew from here to Turkey, Istanbul, direct flight down to Juba. It's supposed to be a 5.5-hour flight. That plane detours an hour and a half as soon as it gets about 200 miles north of Khartoum, and it beelines towards Yemen. Then it comes back. Mm-hmm. So the fact that they don't want to risk that plane being shot down, it just means there's enough weapons being supplied that people can take each other out any given time. Anybody can be a casualty, and they don't want to risk that on the global sense, where planes will fly out of the route and detour just to avoid flying over Khartoum.
So you think that's why people are not really paying attention?
People are not paying attention because there's no good side to choose.
And it's brown people at the end of the day.
Yeah.
That's what it is. A lot of stuff that happens to us, unless somebody with a white complexion like Coney 20 whatever comes out and says that there is something going on, we don't care. There is stuff going on in the Darfur genocide. There's stuff going on in Sudan genocide, in South Sudan, in Congo. There's things going on right now, in Chad, in Niger. It's so many countries that are being destabilized by this, and I always go back to the geopolitical war between the BRIC nation, which is led by China and Russia, against the NATO-led nations, which is led by America, Britain, Europe, etc. These countries, they create these geopolitical wars where we are just pawns in their chessboards, and our lives don't really matter as far as what is going to make their profits go up. And at the end of the day, there's only a couple of minerals that they care about, and a lot of those minerals are in Congo, a lot of those minerals are in Sudan, a lot of those minerals are in Niger, Chad. All these countries have these minerals that they need, and your life don't really matter as much as the profits. And as such, so when you see a lot of when even like Israel versus Gaza, it's easy to kind of point that out, because it's a lot of Palestinians here in America, so they can always push that out. It's a lot of Sudanese here in America as well. My sister is in Khartoum. I have a brother in Khartoum. I have a bunch of half brothers and half sisters in Khartoum. So all my cousins are from Khartoum. So a lot of people, we are there and we point it out on social media, but it doesn't get that same veracity as far as because of our complexion.
Yeah.
So they kind of. Go ahead, Vaida.
Yeah. With that, because both of you guys are involved in community organization, solidarity, how do you maintain hope whenever it seems like a hopeless situation? Really is my question for you both.
Or without media backing, supporting what's going on.
I mean, honestly, that's a good question. If you have an answer also, that'd be great to know.
Well, I do want to point it to Nisrin as well, because she's been deeply involved with communities in Sudan. So can you share a firsthand account of what it looks like on the ground right now? Because I have family that's been displaced from Khartoum as well. And I heard that a lot of, most of Sudan has kind of went to Egypt or Chad. So if you can kind of share what it looks like on the ground right now with the audience, that'd be great.
Yeah, sure. And I did want to just kind of answer the previous question very briefly, if it's okay,
sure,
around
yes, please.
We don't really hear about this war. And I do think it's intentional. I think, currently Sudan constitutes the world's largest displacement crisis. the numbers are, anywhere between 11 and 14 million people have been displaced, many multiple times, including, our own family members who have been displaced 3-4 times. I think about over half the population of 48 million, which is, I think about 26 million or so, are kind of on the brink of starvation, if you will, or facing famine in a country that, I should add, could easily feed itself and the entire region, right? If we think about the Jazeera, it was once touted as the breadbasket of the Middle East. It's got, very fertile land, many parts of, including Darfur, very fertile lands, right? But of course, part of what we've seen over the last 20 years during the Bashir regime was the privatization of the agricultural sector, the decimation of rural livelihoods, private sector investments, primarily from foreign countries. So I look at that in my own research. And I've traced the approximately $27 billion that the Saudis and Emiratis have invested in Sudanese land and infrastructure, right, ports and things like that. And before the war, they controlled more Sudanese land than all of Sudan's domestic investors combined. Right? And much of that land was not being used to produce crops for human consumption, but mostly actually to produce rodus and kind of animal feed that was then exported to the Gulf for their dairy production. So you've heard of Saudi companies like Arnabi or Al-Mara'i and things like that, right? These Gulf kind of yogurt and milk companies. Those are the ones that are benefiting. And so just to take it a step back, at the very end of the civil war with South Sudan, there were Canadian companies, right, that were benefiting, oil and mining companies, European as well, that were benefiting from the war and were essentially giving the Sudanese government money to clear oil fields, right, at one of the most violent phases of the civil war. And so I mentioned that to say that, yes, whenever there are corporate interests, and all wars do, right, certainly to some degree, there is going to be, the corporate media is going to be silent about it in the sense that they're not going to be revealing that aspect of the war.
Right.
And also, and so there's that. I think that the Congo, it's been going on since 1996. The entire Silicon Valley sort of runs on resources, right, that come from the Congo. And part of the reason we don't hear about it in the mainstream media is because of that profiteering. And similarly, I think the fact that we're not hearing about the largest humanitarian and largest displacement crisis in the world is because of the implications it then has for the international community to act.
Yeah.
We have more Sudanese refugees or, displaced people than any other person in the world, if you will. But there are no countries that have issued refugee visas for Sudanese people. Whereas, as we know, for Ukrainians, there were plenty. And so I think that's also another aspect of it. Only 26% of the aid package that is required to kind of have a robust aid response in Sudan has been received by the international community. So there's a real lack of willingness to support, right? And to open up borders and to, really kind of put their money where their mouth is, if you will. And the media has a role to play in that. So I just wanted to say that.
Do you think a part of that is that, like, Africa is innately synonymous with suffering? Like, I always say this, that, like, the idea of Sudan, even in media, even in like a Family Guy clip, is either suffering or people that are malnourished. Congo is the same thing, of like the consistent war. It's like they pretend like it's some innate spiritual thing that's happening to these groups of people when they're benefiting the most from it. So it's overt and it's consistent with what they've always done, which is like, no, we're not going to cover this because we benefit too much from this. So why cover it if I'm still getting paid from the companies that get paid off of these people dying?
And you may be in bed with these countries. You might have to go against countries that you're already in bed with or have relationships with. So like why highlight the war in Sudan when there's so many external factors that you may have interest in or you work with, or just relate to. So
the Middle East needs a lot of the agricultural land that East Africa has, and so they're not going to highlight things that are against their bottom line. They will highlight, Israel versus Palestine because it's beneficial to rise up the world against a certain country.
And that's another point to the media
But-
war, because it makes it look like they are
Yeah.
neutral in
But
every conflict.
But I think a lot of it also kind of points out to what KK said. It's hard to in this battle. It's hard to find who's the good guy. You have two forces who are both genocidal, who both cause a lot of genocide, who are both cause a lot of war crimes, and it's like, so even if the army or the RSF wins, who wins at the end?
Well,
But the
let's-
good
let's
guys,
be
the
honest,
good guys are the
people.
civilians. Yeah,
the people.
the
But the
civilians,
civilians
are the good guys.
are not fighting those two wars. It's not that they're fighting. They're fighting, but they don't have the military backing of these outside forces that these two armies have. One of them is going to win, and the loser in all of this is going to be the Sudanese people.
Can I ask this
And that's
question?
the issue.
Can I ask this question about what he just said? Because it makes sense now. So, for example, in the Congo, right, the people are the ones that are suffering, and nobody's talking about who specifically benefits, right? So, the Congo, for example, there are other countries in Africa who are doing well right now that benefit from what's happening in the Congo. The same
Rwanda.
way, yeah, I wasn't trying to say that, but same way that in Sudan, the conflicts that are going to Sudan, these other countries are benefiting, and when the people are the ones that are suffering, no one wants to speak up, because either side winning is still a win for everybody else around the world. Because, I mean, with a certain system, there needs to be a lower class in the caste system that's suffering. So do you think that is a part of the whole situation, or am I just getting too conspiracy
Or
theory?
are you reaching?
Am I reaching?
No. In a world, there has to be a loser.
I want to hear that. I wanna hear that.
Is-
I mean, my thoughts on the whole like media situation are a few. Like, I do agree that there isn't a clear good guys and bad guys. There isn't like a very clear narrative, and Western media loves a clear narrative for sure. And it has happened before in Sudan. Like, for example, the genocide in Darfur, it was very easy to be like, the Arab Muslim majority central government is very bad, and the Darfuri people are the victims. And in that case, it makes sense. But in this situation, there's this and there's that, and there's a civilian population that revolted, and they had a whole revolution. Like, we also have agency and we have power, but we're not being seen as like we don't have a stake in the war. Like you mentioned, we don't have arms in the whole situation. We're not at the table. Like, civilians are not really, and when I say civilians, I mean like the regular people. Like the normal Sudanese everyday people are not a part of this conversation. It's just these two groups that there isn't a good side, there isn't a bad side. They're Africans in a country that has had so much war, so much violence, so much poverty. They're always, like, it's true, we're in the news for a lot of terrible reasons. Except in my opinion, the revolution was supposed to be, I thought, like, it was a moment when people would have seen like, oh, there's so much power here, there's so much agency. That's how I felt, but that's not the case, I guess. And then the other thing, which is like very practical, and maybe it doesn't change the systemic aspect of like the lack of media attention, but a lot of Sudanese people on the ground don't have the means to communicate out about what's happening to them. Like, people literally have had their phones stolen by the RSF. Like, a lot of people, everything that they own has been taken away from them, or they had to leave it behind when they were displaced. People don't necessarily have money. The connection, the internet, phone connection, all that stuff is very, very bad. We're connected to people on the ground. Like, we're working directly with volunteers on the ground who are part of the emergency response rooms, and we can talk about that a lot more. And we're hearing from them, but we also have situations when we don't hear from them for a while, or the communication with them is like patchy, or some days they have internet, some days they don't, or the WhatsApp messages don't go through and all that stuff, And then in addition to that, it's also like, it makes it hard to like form connections, like in response to the war too, because all our regular, like the way that we are like used to relating to each other and our connections and our communities, this is all falling apart now. And it has fallen apart since April 2023. Like, people are so displaced from their homes, from their neighborhoods. People are separated from their families, from their loved ones, from their friends. And it's like really hard, like people are so isolated all over the place, whether they're displaced internally in Sudan, even displaced internally within their own city. Like, some people left one part of Khartoum that was very violent to another part of Khartoum, or, in other places, or displaced to other countries. But like, all these connections that used to exist that made it so that people could organize together and communicate with each other, it's that much harder now to be able to do.
Yeah.
And it's like there's that many more barriers to be able to do that. And as much as we have like a responsibility, obviously, to talk about it, and that's why we're like on this podcast, and we're glad you guys have us on, so we could talk about this, because these are the platforms. Honestly, these are the platforms that are talking about it. Is like the regular everyday folks and like the organizers on the ground in different cities in North America or outside of Sudan or whatever, that are talking about it. Like it's such a much more like, I guess, almost like a grassroots initiative to try to get people to talk about Sudan and to support Sudanese people and to understand it and to advocate for it, because the systems that like at play are not going to do it, and it's already harder for us to be able to do that.
Yeah.
Absolutely. I do also want to touch on the future implications of what this will mean for the next generation of the young people, because I know my cousins are not in school right now and haven't been in school for a long time. So the elders worried for the future of their kids because there's no school, there's no jobs, there's no future. So the morale of the people is also very, very low. Like you said, sometimes you can't get through. If you send money, it's hard for them to be able to go and receive the money. It can take a long time before they actually receive the money. So even though they have family outside that is trying to reach out and trying to help them, they might not necessarily be able to access that. So again, just the morale of the people and what it looks like for the people that have been displaced right now and for the future of the young people moving forward after this conflict.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. I think the statistic is maybe around 9 million children have been out of school since the war started.
Oh my God.
And, there's some situations where schools have started up again and then stopped and started and stopped. And a lot of schools are literally being used as like shelters. The ERRs that we support, like they run community kitchens out of a lot of schools. A lot of displaced people are living in the schools. That's aside from the fact that the system is obviously not working. Like the children are not in school and the schools are being used for something else. And it's all just so tragic. Like when you think about all these young people that their education's been disrupted and their livelihoods and their obviously all the other stuff there, access to food and clean water and all the illnesses that are being spread and everything, just the everyday aspect of it.
What has your work with the Sudan Solidarity Collective revealed about the most urgent needs of the people affected by the war?
I think food is such a major need that it's like all the means of like all the food sources that regularly would have existed have been so disrupted. So many people have lost their jobs, so there's no income. And food sources just generally, it's harder to access everything. And then, of course, like security and safety for everybody. The work that we're doing right now in the Sudan Solidarity Collective, a lot of it is that we are raising funds for our Sudan Solidarity Fund. And it is supporting on-the-ground volunteers, mainly the emergency response rooms. And these are civil society formations that sort of formed through the resistance committees, which organized and led the revolution. Young people, mostly in their neighborhoods, among each other, resisting the Bashir regime, resisting the military afterwards, and now part of the war relief efforts and resisting their people not existing anymore, right? And just being very resilient and organizing that war relief effort so that they're organizing community kitchens to feed large numbers of people, families that have been displaced or for whatever reason don't have access to food. They're supporting them getting their medicine. They're supporting them in accessing whatever they might need. And it's a lot of work to be able to do that for large numbers of people, and it's incredibly impressive what they're able to do. So these emergency response rooms have been created across the country. In Khartoum, I'm not sure of the exact number of emergency response rooms, but they cover the entire state. So that there's specific local emergency response rooms in the entire, all the neighborhoods of Khartoum. Similarly, they are functioning in Al Jazeera, in Al Gadaris, in Dongola, in Darfur, in so many places across the country. And these are the people that we're supporting directly because we just see this as this is the resistance to the war, is like people staying alive and keeping each other alive and keeping their communities alive, and doing so without the need of the state. Like, this is operating outside of the FAF, the RSF, and battling it out with each other. This is us just keeping each other safe, and we feel like that's all we can do, I think, at the moment, is just support the people on the ground that are keeping people safe and keeping them fed. And it's been very difficult to do it, but we found like a lot of support. We found a lot of support with people that I wouldn't necessarily think would have supported Sudan, you know? And I think like in talking to so many people from so many different communities, so many people don't necessarily know about Sudan, but they want to support. They hear things, but they don't know how, and all of that. And I feel like it's been really beautiful, honestly, to give folks like an opportunity to do something and to connect, and to do so in a way that's like with a lot of like dignity and support. You know, a lot of what we're doing, like when we're giving this financial support to the emergency response rooms, we're not acting like UN agencies and stuff, telling them you have to spend this much on this many people in this specific place and only buy this type of food. We're flexible. We trust them. We know that they're the ones that know what their needs are. So if we give them a sum, we've provided them with a sum of money, the donations that we managed to collect in mostly North America, and this sum of money was supposed to be for food for X number of families, but in fact they actually need the money to like replace the roof on the community center or whatever that they managed to build, then that makes sense for them. Whereas other like sorts of UN agencies and stuff are so restrictive and they're so controlling and paternalistic, and they control the way that people like receive aid. And that's something that we're trying to not do and replicate, because it just like creates like, you know, so much dependency. And obviously Africa has all these problems with the international development system. So that's something we're trying really hard to do. And we're learning along the way about how to do it and how to do that with like a lot of dignity and care.
Is it difficult to? Oh, I'm sorry, Khaldah. I just want to ask you a question, because you said how sometimes they're restrictive. Like these organizations, big organizations are restrictive on how they allocate the aid. Do you feel like the diaspora, we really need to give the autonomy to the people on the ground? Because sometimes even the diaspora in here as South Sudanese, sometimes we're like, oh, we know what's good for South Sudanese people back home. You know, we have that mindset, and we think we know what's best. Do you think we need to like give voices to the people who are actually on the ground, who are actually living the circumstances day to day, and let them decide what needs to be done? Because I think that's a big thing. It's like that the diaspora has the power and the money and the resources and the access to do certain things, but we don't know everything. Can you speak to that?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we certainly do. Like, we don't know what's happening on the ground. We barely actually have access to knowing everything that's really happening because of the lack of communication and stuff. And life has changed so much. Like, I can't even though I'm from Khartoum, I can't even picture what it would be like now. Like, it's, you know, when I see videos of it and when I hear people describe what's happening over there and stuff, it's not even the reality that I know of. Like, it's a completely different place than it used to be. So it's even far removed from like the typical diaspora experience of being like, oh, we know what's right for on the ground, because the like life over there has changed so much over less than 2 years.
Yeah.
That we really, you know, it doesn't, like, there's so many things that don't even make sense. I mean, like the day-to-day life of Khartoum that we would have known, that people from Khartoum would have known, doesn't even exist anymore. Like, so many of the bridges are destroyed, and these roads don't work, and there's like so many struggles with like, oh, this entire area just doesn't have electricity. They just haven't had electricity for an entire year. And that's not a reality that anybody in diaspora, had they not lived through the war, would know about. Yeah. And then these are the things that the folks on the ground are actually dealing with and finding solutions to, or trying to find solutions to. And so our role would be to support them financially if we can, and then to support them, like, and to trust them, would like support them through our trust and our solidarity in that way.
Yeah. Yeah. And Nisrin, I have a question for you. Because we talked about, sorry, I'm having a little bit of brain fog. Have like a flu and a fever. Like there's a bug going around in Dallas, and it's bad. So
keep it on that side.
Yeah, I know.
We're
So
both
forgive
struggling.
me. Yeah, me and Christine are trying to push through, but forgive me if I have a little brain fog. But Nisrin, I wanted to ask you because I saw an interview you did in Toronto, and you talked about how, Hemeti and Burhan should have never had a seat at the table because of their war crimes in southern Sudan and Darfur, and how they were further legitimized by international organizations. And I want to kind of correlate that and connect that to South Sudan, and talk about the elephant in the room between South Sudan and Sudan, because I think there is a lot of like resentment that South Sudanese people have towards Sudan, because we feel like when we were going through our struggle and our conflict, a blind eye was turned to our marginalization, our genocide. And obviously there's a nuanced conversation. There's so much complication there's a lot that goes into that. So I want you to kind of speak to that, to like our South Sudanese audience, because some people from South Sudan is like, why would you even discuss this? This is have nothing to do with us. Like, these people turned a blind eye to us. Why should we care? And I kind of want you guys to talk to that with your understanding and your knowledge, because you guys understand both sides.
Yeah, no, thank you for that question. Where do I start? I mean, I think
it's deep.
I feel like we could have a whole episode on that potentially, but I think for one, I think very much so the very long war with South Sudan against South Sudanese people was ignored. I mean, I think there were definitely people in the north that resisted, right? If you think about the 1964 revolution, it was sparked by the death of a student at the University of Khartoum who, there was a symposium on the question of like South Sudanese autonomy and so forth. So it's not that there was no resistance, but as far as sort of a mass mobilization that we saw in 2018, there wasn't, right? And also I think this was partly because starting in the 90s, the Bashir regime really perfected counterinsurgency that they sort of developed in South Sudan, right? The same tactics that were used against South Sudanese civilians, communities, were then later used in Darfur, were used against protesters in Khartoum, maybe not in the same ways, but again, it's sort of all part of the same apparatus of state violence. And I don't want to reduce the violence that, especially non-Arab communities have experienced in Sudan only to state and business elites. I mean, I think there is a kind of racist propaganda machine that regular, ordinary Sudanese people oiled in many ways, if you will, including people in my own family. When you talked, for example, about Darfur, and people would say, that's an exaggeration, or and some of it has to do with the way that the state media was controlled, but a lot of it is also, racism and sort of misinformation, propaganda, etc. And people, I know that there are people who were dispossessed of their land, who then became, in the Jazeera, for example, who became part of the state apparatus that then oppressed dissidents and protesters in Khartoum, but also in Darfur, right? That they became sort of ordinary people who were themselves marginalized by the state, whether through land dispossession or other forms, became part of the security regime that kept expanding, the security state that kept expanding. And so I think, we saw, as Khaldah mentioned in 2013, the resistance committees emerge, young people in their neighborhoods who are fed up with the system of elite rule, right? Really take on the role of the state in their own neighborhoods and, organize things like COVID prevention, sliding scale food market, flood relief efforts. I remember this very well. I think it was in 2016 and I was part of this as well, where young people were watching the state ignore people who were impacted by floods across the country and then decided to take on that sort of relief effort on their own, right? And that's really what these emergency response rooms are emerging from. And what they demonstrate, like Khaldah mentioned, is that really Sudanese people, ordinary Sudanese people who have the interest of, or, their own people sort of at heart, can run a state without the state, if you will, right? They've been running the country since 2013, essentially, in the absence of a civilian state. And so to me, going back to that question of like, we only see despair, famine, the healthcare system has collapsed. Yes, 19 million children are out of school, etc. All of these statistics paint a very, very like sort of gloomy picture. But to me, what I'm seeing is ordinary people stepping into the gap, the void that the state has left behind as they're fighting each other over resources and political and economic control, to basically say we can run this whole country on our own. We don't need you all. You can, go back to your barracks. We need to demilitarize for sure. I think that's what needs to happen after the war. And, there needs to be a truth and reconciliation process, some form of transformative justice, because that's also partly what I think we can learn from Darfur and South Sudan, is that there was never justice and accountability, right? And without justice and accountability, you can never have peace. And so that needs to be at the forefront. And some of that has to do with the fact that the legal system, the sort of constitutional aspects of that was never transformed in any significant way for there to actually be justice. But I think that is one of the first steps. And, I think also this new generation to me does give me a lot of hope, because certainly during the sit-in, during the revolution, there was a lot of political education happening where people from Darfur were teaching people from other parts of the country what they had gone through. People were recognizing some of the same military folks that had been oppressing them, like in Khartoum, right? So they were making those connections as well and saying, let's not actually trust everybody here, even if they're saying they're on the side of the revolution. So yeah, and I also want to say just to kind of, and I know I'm kind of all over the place, sorry, but
no, it's a complicated, it's a heavy question. It's like layered.
And we need to have you here again, because the knowledge that you've just spread within this period of time, we need you again for a more expansive episode or episodes, because what you've been saying has been facts, and it has been something that has been needed to be said, because we've had a lot of ignorance being thrown from any side of the aisle. So like you being able to give us historical facts and like give us the truth that a lot of people who are emotionally damaged would never give us is something that I think we need to talk about also. But continue what you're saying. I'll just say thank you.
Yeah, no, thank you. That we appreciate that a lot. I think for me, one of the things I also wanted to mention is we often see, for example, the North and Center, right? Especially the Center where my father's family's from, as a kind of monolith, right? And it used to be, in many ways, much more homogenous than it is now. But over the last 20 years, and I've been working, as I said, with mostly landless farm workers and farmers in the Jazeera who've been dispossessed. The Jazeera is a microcosm of the country. There are lots of South Sudanese, for example, who are working in mostly construction because of the decimation of the agricultural sector in the kind of brick-making sections. They're also working on the farms. There's lots of people from Darfur, people who were displaced, coming to the Jazeera to work, on farms who don't own land. And so, most people don't know that about 39%, like 40% of the population of the Jazeera is non-Arab landless workers, right?
And we wanted to talk about the diversity of Sudan as well, because I think a lot of people don't understand that Sudan is not like just an Arab, like it's not fully like Arab populated. And a lot of people were like, that's why I didn't really pay attention, because they thought that these people are not really African. And I think we talked about that in the symposium as well as I think Dr. Madani actually kind of touched on how people don't understand that South Sudanese people are Black, or the demographic, the diversity of Sudan. Like people don't really understand it. So I would love to hear more about that. So I'm sorry to interrupt you.
No, and and I think there are obviously lots of people who identify as Arab. That's a whole other question, right? That also has to do with, I think, a long history of forced Arabization and Islamization. But of course, I think people who identify as Arab also have certain privileges that we can't deny. Like I don't want to, be one of those people who's like comes to America and decides I don't want anything to do with, with what Arab privilege means in that context, to deny that, because then we become like the white folks who claim indigenous heritage based on like a great grandmother or something like that. I think there is, and these are some of the questions and the issues that we have to confront, I think, especially once the guns are silenced. How do we talk about this long history of forced Arabization, Islamization, and also the long history of slavery in the Jazeera? Like I look at the community that I'm from in the Jazeera has people of enslaved descent who, and slavery didn't really end until the 1940s or 50s, who continue to labor on other people's land, who continue to be marginalized and discriminated against, even though where their houses are located are in more flood-prone areas. So you see the sort of geographical, the sort of spatial, racial sort of injustice there as well, that I think are all things that we have to grapple with when we talk about race in the context of Sudan. And race has always been used, racialized divisions in particular, for the extraction of capital, for the accumulation of power, right, by elites. Yeah. People use sort of these divide and conquer tactics in order to be able to exploit. And I'm going to say something somewhat controversial here, but one of the things that I noticed by doing research in the Jazeera is that some of the most marginalized people, in addition to the landless workers from more displaced areas like Darfur who come to the Jazeera to work on the farms who don't own land, the other marginalized group are nomadic pastoralist Arab groups that have been cut off from their land because of agribusiness, right? Who create these big farms. They hire often people like the RSF to secure those farms. They shoot at herders when they try to enter those farms. And those are the main targets of groups like the RSF right now, because they've been marginalized by the state. And then they use that grievance, right? It gets sort of exploited essentially by elites to then do their dirty work for them. And we have to, I think, grapple with that question in especially the post-war period, because we're going to have to do a massive demilitarization, right? There needs to be some type of transformative justice process, but we have to also acknowledge the ways that different groups have been marginalized by the state, even those who might identify as Arab. So I think that is another aspect of this, yeah.
Can I just add a quick, you kept referencing the demilitarization of Sudan, and I think the challenge is the fact that martial law is kind of more of like it's more of, what's the word I could use? It's the basis of policing. It's the default state of Sudan and North and South, because the military themselves are basically the police, and they're the ruling class that control everything else. So you can't really demilitarize Sudan itself. You can maybe rebuild the military into something better and give them a smaller amount of control, but to demilitarize the country itself, I think it's more of a stretch because of the nature of the country itself and how it is. It's not going to happen within the next 50 to 100 years if I see it that way, because it takes more change to take everybody who treats the military how they treat them. And even at the end of this war, whatever side wins, they're going to keep treating them as the elites of power when it comes to controlling the people. And that's the challenge that I don't think we're going to see as fast as we like.
Yes, I think you're right.
Yeah.
Oh, no, sorry, go ahead.
No, I was going to say, I would love to hear your y'all's response to that.
I mean, I think you're right. And certainly we don't want to be replacing an elite military state with an elite democracy either. I think that can also be, but I do think that, I mean, again, going back to the kind of resistance committees, the emergency response rooms, I do think that what we've seen over the last, certainly since the revolution, we've seen a mass mobilization of people on the ground in Sudan from all parts of Sudan, right, including South Sudanese folks. Many people were involved in the revolution as well, who have really, to me, put forth a vision of a popular democracy from the bottom up that recaptures power from elites and redistributes it. As ideal as that might sound, I know that might sound very utopian and ideal, but I do think that there is, to me, what this war has shown us is that the Sudanese state in its current formation is not viable. It needs to be dismantled, right?
Definitely.
Because it has always been ethno-nationalist and violent and extractive, right? It has always used racialized divisions in order to accumulate power. And so I think there, to me, again, going back to the late Dr. John Garang's vision of a new Sudan, and that itself might be critiqued perhaps, but certainly in terms of building a secular state that embraces Sudan's diversity, that and also that, and I would add to that, and maybe this is not necessarily part of his vision, but to me, I think what the revolutionaries have put forward is really the sort of bottom-up approach to democracy, of building sort of power at local councils at the neighborhood level.
Correct.
To me, that has not been seen in the region. It doesn't mean it can't be seen.
I can agree with that. But I just see the challenges of that happening. It's just more the fact that these military groups and these special force groups, they have more resource than the local people. The regular civilians, no matter how many, if I have my community, we're 100,000 deep. We can't go up against missiles and bombs. And that's just the reality of it. And that's the challenges that we have to find ourselves and support ourselves and get more resources that we can fight fire with fire if we had to. It's not saying what we need to do, but as people, if you want to become free, sometimes you have to fight fire with fire. And at the civilian level, we can't do that at this moment.
Yeah. No, I think you're right. And I think there's a way that as a Northern Central Sudanese, I also speak from a position of privilege when I talk about nonviolent resistance, right? Like even during the revolution, when people were resisting in Darfur, they were being met with a much sort of different level of violence than people in Khartoum were. And so I think those are all very real dynamics. And yeah, I mean, I just want to mention, I think part of the trigger, the reason the coup, the October 2021 coup started, right, which to me was sort of the beginning of this war, if you will, is because there was pressure on the SAF and the RSF to hand over their companies to civilian oversight. So there was a push for them to sort of start letting go of some of their assets, if you will, or to have more civilian oversight of them, and they didn't want to do that, right? And so essentially, again, this war is being fought at the expense of the civilian population in order for these elites to continue controlling the economy and to profiteer from it, as well as their international partners, of course, you know.
Also with these elites, that they were more looking at the fact of force themselves, like they can't make us do these things because we have all the resources to do what we like. So if we could slowly, like you said, we would need to start at the ground level up and slowly come from the bottom up, but it takes more of bringing in more resources from outside in, and we have to, I think like we should focus more on one central area. If it was to ever happen, focus on one side, focus one area, grow that as strong as you can, and then monopolize it to the next region and grow that region to the same level. And now you have more, you could say, you have more of a utopia between the two people, the two areas that are standing on the same side. Now they have the same amount of resources, the same amount of knowledge, whatever it is that they need to understand how to move forward. And it's like a Lego game. You got to keep stacking your Legos little by little.
It definitely, I mean, it definitely happens, you know, in the words of the French Revolution, you got to eat the rich. That's who the elites are, the rich. And the French Revolution gives us the template.
I don't think the French Revolution is like the best revolution to be an example.
The French Revolution toppled kings.
Revolved.
No, it toppled kings. It toppled probably the biggest military in Europe at that time. Yeah. So yeah.
And then the war is being further complicated by it's being further complicated by external factors that are profiting off of the war and profiting off of the lives of Sudanese people at the end, because it's the Sudanese civilians are the ones who are getting the brunt of the war. It's not the elites. It's not the two leaders, and that's unfortunate. I think that's something that's seen. I think that's reflective of South Sudan as well.
But with that, it's more of the people like we have to unite. At the end of the day, like we have to put apart our differences, whatever it's ethnic groups, whatever city you grew up in. In Sudan, people could be from Durman and they have beef with people from Riyadh just because they're different neighborhoods. But just same as back home, people in certain neighborhoods could be like, "Oh, what's going on?" Like just recently with the attempt of coup that started off with 2 soldiers in Tongping and Juba. Just because somebody did not want to give up his power and he had people backing him that had weapons with them, they could start something small, even though it was not as big as it was what it was blown up to be. It's just 2 soldiers shooting. Nobody's really hurt. But with something like that, it's more of the people, they have to have more control within themselves and come together to unite. Yeah. Because together you stand. Yeah. Apart you fall.
So unfortunately we're running out of time. I feel like we can have this conversation for hours, and we hope to have you guys back to maybe break down like some portions of this. So we can talk about like the proxy wars for one full episode, and talk about the demographic of Sudan, and even like you said this spans back to the 19th century. We can start from there. So I think we got to break this down to get even more from the conversation. But before we close out, I want to ask you both, and there may not be an answer at this moment, what do you see as the way out? Do you see a way out, or like the light at the end of the tunnel for Sudan right now within this conflict?
Yeah, I mean, I think even when you were talking earlier about like people needing to unite, or the idea of demilitarization as being like, how do you work toward it? Like, it's such a big thing that, is it possible? Can it not be possible? And I feel like, for me at least, I have to believe that this stuff is possible. Like, I have to believe that like demilitarization can happen. I have to believe that there can be freedom, justice, peace in Sudan. in the entire region and all of Africa. Like, I have to believe that it's possible, and that like the people who I see and I hear about and I'm talking to that are there right now, that are feeding folks, that are cooking the food, buying the food, making sure children are fed, trying to get, you know, if it's possible for children to get to schools, trying to get that to happen. All of these things are, I think, the only thing that we can put hope into. And what that eventually leads to, I have no idea. Like, you know, some kind of a hopefully free and just world that maybe we live to see, or maybe we don't live to see. But I think like the working toward it right now is the light for me. Like, working toward these things right now and being with the people who need our support and doing what we can to support people and listening to them and believing them and trusting them, and not feeding into power hungry sides, not feeding into an idea that like this side will protect me and this side won't protect me, and that I have to believe in the state regardless, and that military power can do anything like that. Not believing that stuff. So I think that's what gives me hope, at least.
Yeah, I mean, I was going to just add to that. I agree fully with what Khaldah said. I think, you know, my mother once said to me that we don't have the privilege of sort of losing hope in this situation. I think especially for people, you know, who, I mean, there's also a class aspect to this war. I feel like the middle and upper class evacuated quite quickly, but the vast majority of Sudanese who don't have passports, who don't have, you know, savings and so forth, are stuck. And these are the people that are on the ground that need to kind of guide the way forward and sort of craft the solutions for what needs to happen next. And I think, you know, for me, one thing I will say as somebody living in a diaspora who's not necessarily in a position to offer solutions, but I will say that I think what Sudan's history has shown us is that military elites have become experts at negotiating peace without ever implementing it, right? They've been, I think, you know,
that's a bar right there.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know the exact number. My friend Khalid, I think, once said that there've been about 27 peace agreements that have been signed in Sudan's history, none of which have led to justice and accountability, none of which have led to sustainable peace. In fact, peace has become a currency for military elites, kind of legitimize their war crimes, to accumulate power, right, to absorb opposition forces, to continue suppressing them, right? And so I think we need to move away from these exclusive high-level negotiation mechanisms, because they just sort of do the same, you know, they sort of in many ways prolong wars rather than silence the guns and so forth. And so
I remember, I think I saw an interview where you were talking about the Jeddah talks, where they were meant to go and negotiate, like I believe a ceasefire, correct me if I'm wrong. And you said that peace was never on the table. Like, how do you have peace talks when peace is never negotiated? And so it's kind of like, you know, like smoke and mirrors in a way, trying to portray an image when in actuality they have no intention of stopping the war, at least in with their own measures and within themselves. And so, yeah.
Absolutely. Yes, no, exactly. I mean, and the brokers, right, the main brokers, Saudi Arabia, the US, the UAE, and Egypt, they've historically supported military rule in Sudan, right? They've propped up military elites at the expense of kind of more popular revolutionary demands, certainly during the revolution, right, during that transition period. And so these aren't really honest peace brokers in that sense either. I would much rather these processes, if there's going to be, I'm against high-level negotiation mechanisms that exclude the people most impacted anyway, but if they're going to happen, they should happen on the African continent. They should be brokered by African leaders and African countries, because there's more at stake for them, right? Like in South Sudan, I mean, I know there's, you know, of course, internal issues, but if stability in Sudan will help South Sudan's economy, right? And in terms of the oil pipeline going through Sudan and so forth. And so there is a broker who has a lot more at stake there, right?
Yeah.
They want peace because it will also stabilize South Sudan. And so I think that's, you know, one. But then the other area is, let the resistance committees tell you what the path forward is. They know, they have laid out a vision for how to end this war and how to get out of it and so forth. And we need to take them seriously as political actors. We have never taken them seriously as political actors. And I think you all have this platform. I think it's worth it to think about maybe bringing on, if it's possible technologically, like some people from the emergency response room, some people from the resistance committees to answer that particular question, I would say also.
Yeah,
Definitely.
absolutely.
Definitely.
Awesome.
Absolutely.
Well,
And there was a lot more questions that we had, but we would love to have you both back on if you would like, if you guys are willing and able, and we would love to have you back on to kind of further discuss this. But go ahead, Christine.
no, I was going to say maybe we can do a panel in the future and source some of those people that you recommended. But I just want to thank you both for all of the insight that you shared today. And I know our viewers are going to take a lot from it. I know I learned a lot today that I didn't know, especially about the history back to the 1950s. And it was just very, very fascinating to learn how kind of this has been a pattern that's happened and is continuing to happen. So I thank you both. Can you please just share where our viewers can find you, just in case they want to kind of support what's going on with the Sudan Solidarity Collective, or anything that you guys want to promote?
Yeah, and any way we can help, our viewers can help, and our audience can help as well.
It'd be great if folks could go to our website, sudansolidarity.com, and check us out on Instagram at Sudan Solidarity Collective. We try to be as transparent as possible about our work, about where funds go. We promote events if they're happening. If people want to partner with us, if people want to reach out to us to do any events or anything like that, they're more than welcome to. And even just have discussions about maybe we could organize together. Yeah, that'd be great.
Awesome.
Yeah, and just to add to that, we've probably raised almost $500,000 Canadian for these emergency response rooms, and it's mostly coming from small donors, $10 a month. We're trying to get more monthly donors so we can sustain this work. We're currently also going to be supporting a We Must Plant campaign by a farmers alliance that is trying to grow food in areas where it's relatively safe to do so, but doesn't have the money, the seeds, they need to clean their irrigation canals, etc. There's also a tea vendors union that we're trying to support, Sitata Shai, many of whom are from sort of areas that have been impacted by war much longer than this current one. And so, yeah, we have different partners. You can learn more about them on our website, sudansolidarity.com. But in particular, I think we value small donor support because it's sort of people-to-people solidarity. Yeah. Even $1 will make a big difference, and it allows us to kind of give support with no strings attached. So I really encourage people who are listening to consider that. Thank you so much.
I want to thank you both for taking these complicated topics and simplifying these conversations for our audience to be able to digest. Because I know a lot of times with our podcast, people want to hear it in a more conversational style, and you guys were able to do that for us, and I think our audience will be able to take a lot from this. Our goal was to unpack the current conflict in Sudan, the historical and social context of the war, and its human impact. And I think you both, Nisrin, Khaldah, you guys did it beautifully. So I really, really appreciate your contribution.
And you will continue to do it because there's still more that we got to get into.
Yes, there's still a lot to talk about. Does anybody else on the panel want to say anything?
I just want to say thank you to both of you guys, Nisrin and Khaldah. Like Christine said, I learned so much. I feel like I was back in class, but it also felt very conversational, like Sahra said. So I really appreciate, because we don't get this context, even though our parents, our grandparents lived through this. We don't necessarily get the full scope of it. So I really cherish the perspective that y'all provided, but also not holding back by including how South Sudanese were affected. So I'm very curious and eager to learn more about this and also support Sudan. So thank you both.
Thank you, ladies, so much for being here, and I hope you guys have a great rest of your Saturday.
Yes. And thank you guys for tuning in to the Ladies of Sosa podcast. Again, we're going to make sure to list Nisrin and Khaldah's information and the organizations that they are working with to try to help the best that they can in the current conflict in Sudan. And so thank you so much for tuning in.
Like, comment, share, subscribe, and we'll catch you guys in the next episode.